Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, to our event, The History of Marvel Universe, an interplay between comics and social movements. My name is Joanna King, and on behalf of America House, I want to welcome everyone to this exciting event with some very exciting panelists. I'd like to welcome Stephanie Burt, Evan Narcisse, Douglas Wolk, and moderating our event tonight will be Danny Fingeroth. We're so excited to have them. Just for all of our audience members, I'd like to let you know you're welcome to ask any questions in this event. You can use the chat function in our YouTube, or you may send us emails to event@amerikahaus.de, event@amerikahaus.de. And without much further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our moderator, Danny Fingeroth. Enjoy, thank you.
Okay, I'm unmuting now. I would like to unmute myself. Okay, I am unmuted. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel. And I'm Danny Fingeroth. I was a longtime writer and editor at Marvel. I've written a lot of books about comics. I work with the Will Eisner Studios and Foundation on something called Will Eisner Week. That's an annual celebration of Eisner. Check out willeisner.com for more info. Relevant to this, I'm the author of A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stanley, which came out from St. Martin's Press in 2019. It's a biography of Stan. It was not an authorized biography, although I did know him and had some of the last full-length interviews with him for the book. The book was chosen as a Times of London Entertainment Book of the Year, which was kind of cool. And I also read the audiobook. So if after this hour and a half, this is your idea of a good time, hearing what's coming out of my mouth, imagine 14 hours of that. So the mandate for our panel today is to talk about how our current social movements like Black Lives Matter and the fight for transgender and disability rights connected to comics, and I guess specifically to Marvel Comics in this case. So I'm going to give you a history, a brief 2-minute history. But before I do that, I would be totally remiss to not let these wonderful panelists introduce themselves to you. So I'll start with just how they're coming up on my screen. So Douglas Wolk, unmute yourself and tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Douglas Wolk. I'm a writer and comics historian and critic. I live in Portland, Oregon in the US. I'm the author of this book, which comes out in October, All of the Marvels, subtitled A Journey to the Ends of the Biggest Story Ever Told. It is a book about reading all 27,000 plus Marvel superhero comics since 1961 as one big story and what that story says. I'm also the author of a book called Reading Comics, which won the Eisner and Harvey Awards in 2008. I teach comics history at Portland State University in the US, in Oregon, and I run a podcast called The Voice of Latveria, which is basically, it's sort of about Doctor Doom and sort of about everything except Doctor Doom.
Great, thank you. And Stephanie Burt, unmute and tell us about you.
Hi. I just had to unmute myself twice. Yeah, I'm a longtime fan of the people I get to do this panel with. I feel very lucky. I teach English at Harvard, and I write books that are largely books either about poetry or composed of poetry that I wrote. But I also write essays and articles and other kinds of less than book length works so far. Ooh, there's a recording in progress. I consent to be recorded. Anyway, I do write about comics, and I'm active in X-Men fandom. You can find me as a guest on a couple of my favorite X-Men podcasts. I've written about Marvel Comics Mutants for the New York Times Book Review and a whole bunch of websites and academic places. And I've written about comics and about another Stanley biography, not by Danny, for the New Yorker. Is that enough? I don't know. I have two cats, a dog, and 2 kids, and you're probably going to see one of the cats during the seminar. In fact, there he is. Come on over here, honey. Snowbar, usually you like to, honey? Okay.
She was fine in rehearsal.
I think Snowbar is still wondering whether the mutant cat's eye has been resurrected on Krakoa, but that's fairly niche at this point. I'm going to stop now.
Right.
I mean, she was Snowbar's favorite mutant. She's a cat who's a mutant.
And last, but certainly by no means least, is Evan Narcisse. Have I pronounced
Yeah.
that anywhere near correctly, Evan?
You were close, Danny. I say Narcisse. I also accept Narcisse. But I am a writer, formerly a journalist and cultural critic who focused on pop culture, video games, comic books, animation, TV, movies. I am now on the creative side of things, having written the Rise of the Black Panther series for Marvel. That's the cover behind me. And other works. I was a narrative design consultant on the Miles Morales video game that was published on PlayStation platforms. Yeah, I am a professional superhero nerd who gets paid for all the stuff I read as a kid. Yeah.
Cool. Excellent. So welcome, everybody. Thank you. And thank you, AmeriKahaus, for inviting us. So I'm going to try to, as painlessly as possible, read this history of Marvel. And then I'm actually going to read portions of a editorial, a Stanley soapbox from 1968 that I think is relevant to the topic at hand. So, and I'm going to read it off my screen, so I won't be looking down. So I'll be eerily looking at the screen, but actually reading. So here we go. A guy named Martin Goodman was a publisher of pulps in New York. He went into the pulp publishing business in 1933. In 1938, a publisher called National Comics, you may know it as DC now, put out Action Comics #1, which introduced Superman and started the whole superhero trend. Martin Goodman, being a commercially minded guy, started something called Timely Comics a year later, working at first with a packager of comics. That was an outside company that put together comics, including Submariner and Human Torch, in the first Marvel comic put out by the company called Timely, and it was called Marvel Comics. Pretty clever. By the second issue, it became Marvel Mystery Comics. About a year later, Captain America #1 came out, and although Marvel Comics had been a hit, Captain America was an enormous hit, came out a year before Pearl Harbor, and it made the bold statement of having Captain America punching Hitler in the jaw on the cover. And that was by, that comic was done by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who at that point were working as Goodman's editor and art director. In late 1940, Goodman's cousin, a kid named Stanley, who was about 17 at the time, comes to work as Simon and Kirby's assistant. His role would evolve and develop, of course, and in the course of decades, to the point where he came to embody not just Marvel Comics, but comics in general. We'll talk about Stan, no doubt, as the panel goes on. Simon and Kirby left the company shortly after that over financial disputes with Goodman, which were not uncommon, either at Marvel or anywhere, although again, it was still called Timely. Stan became the editor-in-chief. Superheroes go out of style in the late 40s, but Timely, also known as Atlas, chases fads and is prolific. They're putting out 70 or 80 titles per month, presided over by Stan, and also a large staff of editors and assistants that worked under him. That went on till about, or till exactly 1957, when a lot of societal and business events led to a kind of implosion where Timely, Atlas, Marvel went from 70 or 80 titles a month to 8 titles a month. So they coasted along like that, kind of in shock, but putting out comics. There was a superhero revival at DC Comics in the late 50s, and that success, in the late 50s and early 60s, and that success leads Martin Goodman, or perhaps Jack Kirby. There are debates about who initiated it, but they pushed Stanley to revive superheroes at Timely, Atlas, Marvel. Take your pick of what name you want. That led to the Fantastic Four, which was the first modern Marvel comic, debuting in 1961, soon followed by the Hulk, Spider-Man, Thor, Iron Man, Doctor Strange, X-Men, the Avengers, Daredevil, etc. The main creators during this early period were Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Larry Lieber, Don Heck, Dick Ayers, Paul Reinman, a few others, but that was the basic core. Flo Steinberg was Stan's quote-unquote Gal Friday, and she was certainly part of that mythological early Marvel bullpen. The popularity of the characters grows. Stan uses that popularity to promote his own brand and get his name known to the public, as well as the names and reputations of the artists and even the letterers and the colorists. Stan develops as a celebrity who speaks at colleges and comments on topical subjects in the bullpen bulletins. Most of the comics made by Marvel are created via the so-called Marvel method, which we can talk about later, which leads to endless controversies over who did what and when. That eventually leads to Ditko and then Kirby leaving the company, although both will eventually return. In 1968, Goodman sells the company to Cadence Industries, the first of successive corporate owners of the company. Stanley moves to LA in 1980, where he will concentrate on movies and TV. Kirby has conflicts with Marvel over art returns and other financial issues, and Jack dies in 1994. Oddly, Marvel goes into bankruptcy in 1996. The company had success in the 70s and 80s with animation, and especially with the Hulk live-action TV show with Lou Ferrigno as the Hulk, but they had no sustained Hollywood movie success until Blade, the Blade movie in 1998. The X-Men came in 2000, Spider-Man in 2002. The Marvel Cinematic Universe starts in 2008 with the first Iron Man movie. Disney buys Marvel in 2009 and settles with the Kirby family, who had been suing the company for compensation and credit. They made a settlement in 2014 with the Kirby estate. Comics continue to be produced by Marvel, of course, but sales are certainly not what they were in the heyday. The comics are much seen as research and development for movies and TV. Stanley and Steve Ditko both die in 2018, and needless to say, Marvel reigns supreme today in movies, TV, and video games. So that's a history of Marvel. I left a few things out, but I thought that was that was. So if you'll bear with me just for a moment, again, given the topic and how Marvel interacted with and responded to social movements. Stan, unlike comic editors or publishers from years before, Stan took it upon himself to editorialize in these soapboxes where he would sort of give his views on the events of the day, and very often they were fairly tame and rarely took radical stands, but the fact that he was doing it at all was something novel in comics. And so I just wanted to read an excerpt from a famous soapbox of Stan's from 1968. Let's lay it right on the line. Bigotry and race. Okay. Sorry, I was reading from my own manuscript, and suddenly the screen took over here. Let's lay it right on the line. Bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. But unlike a team of costume supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the snoot or a zap from a ray gun. The only way to destroy them is to expose them, to reveal them for the insidious evils they really are. The bigot is an unreasoning hater, one who hates blindly, fanatically, indiscriminately. If his hang-up is black men, he hates all black men. If a redhead once offended him, he hates all redheads. If some foreigner beat him to a job, he's down on all foreigners. He hates people he's never seen, people he's never known, with equal intensity, with equal venom. Now, we're not trying to say it's unreasonable for one human being to bug another, but although anyone has the right to dislike another individual, it's totally irrational, patently insane to condemn an entire race, to despise an entire nation, to vilify an entire religion. Sooner or later, we must learn to judge each other on our own merits. Sooner or later, if man is ever to be worthy of his destiny, we must fill our hearts with tolerance, for then and only then will we be truly worthy of the concept that man was created in the image of God, a God who calls us all his children. And then he signed it, Pax, I'm probably mispronouncing the Latin, but Pax et Justitia, which means peace and justice, Stan. So that coming out against bigotry may not seem like it's a major social justice stand, but for the time and for the medium where comics were not doing that, it was a pretty damn major thing. So I guess if anybody on the panel, I mean, I have some, as you know, questions, but if anybody has anything they want to say about anything I've read or said up to now, please chime in, or I can go to questions.
Danny, the thing about that soapbox excerpt that is, I think, really amazing is it's written in the classic Stanley style, right? So it's like, right. It's stentorian. It's he's clearly going for like this grandiose Shakespearean language.
Right.
And there's a bit of irony to that in terms of how, the typical image we think of Stan Lee, especially from this era, is as a salesman, as a huckster, so and as a guy who's hyping up the whole enterprise of making comics at Marvel. So for him to use a lot of the same kind of tools in service of a social justice message is, like I said, ironic and almost a little bit funny, but like, you feel like there must have been some kind of great unspoken pressure behind the scenes or just ambiently in the air of society that drove him to do this. Because if I remember correctly, this kind of came out of nowhere.
I think, well, Douglas, what do you think? Did it come out of nowhere, or was there groundwork laid for it in the comics?
There's some precedent for it in the comics. I mean, there's this very kind of like soft, non-specific, up with people kind of attitude that you'll see. The one greatest emotion, love, great. You see that a lot, but this is sharpening it a little bit. It's still not being super specific about it, but it's like, okay, this is a thing for which we stand. We're standing for a thing, and it's kind of lovely to see.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say we're Stan. I mean, it's signed Stan,
yeah.
But since Stan had long since come to embody Marvel. At that point, it was clearly 1968, for those of you who may not have been alive then, was a tumultuous year with Kennedy and King being assassinated and riots in Paris and the Vietnam War escalating, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a half dozen other things. But that for Stan himself was a year. He made a pilot for a TV show where he had a bunch of student radicals on and he interviewed them. It's on YouTube. You can find it, and I discuss it in my book. But it's really kind of wild where he was trying to be, as many of you know, Stan was on the one hand promoting himself as a comics writer and editor and promoting Marvel, and yet always looking to get the hell out of comics, which he had experienced any number of times, even by 1968, is almost disappearing on him. There were times he only had his job because he was Martin Goodman's cousin, when the company almost went away. So yeah, it's a fascinating transition for him and for the company. Stephanie, you look like you're wanting to say something, but you have to unmute yourself.
I tried. So I don't know what, I assume the audience for this is going to vary widely in terms of what comics you know and how well you know them and how long you've been in the world of people talking about comics all the time. There's very, very little about Silver Age, which means generally 60s Marvel, that I can speak to, that this, my co-panelists don't know 100 times more about. But I'm observing, I'm agreeing with the description of Stanley as a person and his relationship to the larger thing that was Marvel Comics, that was always represented by him in this period, and it was never just him. And I'm thinking about the distance between saying that love is good and we stand for love, saying that racism exists and is bad, and recommending a particular course of action in order to reduce the harm done by racism. And I'm thinking about the ways in which individual Marvel stories, maybe matching the attitudes of the Marvel creative teams that are on these stories, have been all over the map about, okay, racism exists. It is very bad. What should you, the reader, and what should we as people who live in a society do about it? And I'm thinking about the range of positions available, maybe not in Silver Age comics, but in later Marvel stories, about what should you do and the way in which not only writers, but continuing characters have represented various and often, credible, non-ridiculous positions on the question, what should we do? But if I keep talking, I'm going to be moving us into 80s and 21st century Marvel stuff, and maybe it's not time
Bring
for
it
that.
on. Yeah.
I actually want to touch on something that you said, Danny, which is, in this part of Stan's career, and for indeed much of the, at least the first half of Marvel Comics as a corporate entity, there was this cloud of ephemerality that was floating around it, right? One of the things I've done is I co-hosted a podcast called Marvel's Declassified, where we talk about people, places, and events that kind of inform, Marvel stories. And you talk to creators from this era, including the era during which you worked in editorial, Danny, and they're like, right, we just didn't think the company was going to be around, in a couple of months, in a couple of years. And I think, knowing that as a backdrop really helps you understand the shakiness of taking a moral kind of imperative stance when it comes to social justice, right? Because it's okay, on one hand, hey, we're on shaky ground here, so we don't want to do anything that's going to potentially upset things and bring this house of cards falling, including taking a stance on on gay rights, on the AIDS crisis. When you hear stories about, for example, North Star, a famous mutant character on a Canadian super team, coming out, when you hear about the background of the story decisions and editorial decisions, that thing barely got out the door, it seems like, and then there was a backlash in the real world to this announcement. They're saying a B or C-list character, depending on how you interpret him at the time, saying he's gay. If you can find it, Stephanie, feel free to share your screen. Yeah, so understanding that these moments of representation from marginalized groups and taking social justice stances were very much something that could affect the company's bottom line, and I think was scary for people in decision-making positions. Now, Danny, you were one of those people, so please let me know if I'm wrong, but that's what it seemed like to me as a reader and a critic.
Well, the comics, they're this very odd mix of messages that they give and the people who create those messages and sort of I mean, I always found it funny, right? I mean, I wrote a whole book called Superman on the Couch that maybe some of you have read about superheroes and what they are really and what they represent and how people, I mean, the idea, I mean, bottom line is these superhero stories are vigilante power fantasies that border onto, dare I say, the F word, you know? I mean, they're fascist superhero fantasies, except that Spider-Man is so nice, you know, and he knows just how much force to use, and you know, he punches guys so they don't break their jaws and webs them up and leave. You know, I mean, that's the superhero fantasy really, is that someone could use that power but know just how much to use it, you know, not that having because in real life, as we know, having costumed vigilantes running around is not a good thing, you know, right? But somehow so you have this mix of a lot of native New Yorkers, people who are pretty liberal and progressive, who kind of, you know, I guess it goes back to when Stan would be accused of the comics of violence. And no, we don't deal in violence, we deal in action, you know, and those are a very subtle difference. You do have to, what's even more fascinating is, I think, is that this is a company, if you look at the origin of every single Marvel hero, except maybe Spider-Man, they all go back to Cold War, you know, anti-commie paranoia. I mean, that's the Fantastic Four, that's the Hulk. I mean, it's very, so that company came from that to 10, you know, to 5 years later, Stan is putting out an editorial saying bigotry is bad, which doesn't seem that bold, but you know, it was a major leap.
Now, one thing that's interesting is that where like strong political positions are being staked out initially is not so much in the comics as in the letter columns. And you will see people writing in, and some of them are real angry. And early on, when you've got letter writers who are real angry about one thing or another, the editorial responses will generally be like maybe gently pushing back, but there's a lot of equivocation, a lot of, well, we don't want to offend anybody, but you, the readers, what do you think? And of course, that's to stir up like more involvement and more letter column. By 1974, I was just looking this up, there's a letter column in an issue of Creatures on the Loose, which is not about Creatures on the Loose at all. Somebody writes, where are you now, Bullpen? You were all right criticizing Lyndon when he was president, but where are you when it comes to Spiro Agnew, Gerald Ford, the gasoline crisis, Bebe Rebozo, the income tax deductions, the fact that the country seems to be folding up? Now you're as quiet as anything about the real enemy of this country, Richard Milhouse Nixon. You disgust me. This is a letter to Creatures on the Loose. But you're also starting to see stronger political content in the comics themselves. There's that amazing Captain America sequence that ends with a very thinly disguised Richard Nixon killing himself in the Oval Office, published like 4 months before Nixon resigned.
That was an intro. You know, look, Stan was the editor of all the comics, especially when they imploded. He edited and scripted, you know, most of them, and he came from what I kind of alluded to a little bit before, from the 50s, from the Wortham era, where there were literally Senate hearings about how pernicious comic books were. And everybody thought, well, that's it. That's the end of it. We're just going to have to find something else to do. So, you know, there's a famous story where Denny O'Neil, who was, you know, kind of a hippie, was a hippie, you know, or I think his company, when he wrote, was called Gentleman Beatnik. You know, Danny was a progressive, but he was a Navy veteran. And I think it was Danny who came in one day in the 60s, in the heart of the counterculture, with like a little pin that said legalize pot. And Stan went crazy and literally ripped the button off of Danny's shirt and said, don't you ever wear that again. And I don't think that even necessarily, I mean, Stan was not a drug guy, but he lived in the suburbs. He lived in the modern era. He had a teenage daughter. He knew what was going on, but he was so afraid that anybody would associate comics with anything that was seen as negative, illegal, immoral. I mean, that, so again, Stan coming out of that, and then the period after Stan, and Stan is the editor-in-chief, and then he kind of delegates to Roy Thomas, and the company grows to be this, it goes from the 8 comics a month to up to 40, 50, 60. And so there's not enough staff to even supervise, or even so that letter column you talked about, probably nobody in-house editorial, no fault of theirs, totally overworked and swamped and overwhelmed. Probably nobody read it till it came out. Whoever wrote it, maybe it was the writer of the comic or an editorial assistant, whoever. If Marvel had been more bureaucratized and there were half a dozen people reading stuff, but that was sort of the magic of that era, where stuff, that you would not expect from, a corporate owner of important intellectual property. You wouldn't expect that to come out from there.
Now, Douglas, just to touch on that again, the Creatures on the Loose letter column was what month and year?
This would have been sometime early 1974. It is a letter from somebody identified only as Roger, no surname or address given. And the response says in part, we do plan to do stories on social issues, as we always have. We do plan to let our individual writers and artists take a stand, but we refuse to prejudge anyone. Yes, we are opposed to high crimes and misdemeanors by presidents of the United States. But until we and the rest of the country know all there is to know, we cannot accuse a man of those improprieties. Understand the distinction? This isn't Creatures on the Loose.
and the Secret Empire storyline runs when?
It's running around the same time, yeah.
Yeah, so it's just...
That's also
we should make clear that this is the 70s Secret Empire storyline that concludes with Nixon shooting himself, not the more recent Secret Empire storyline, which perhaps was not handled with similar tact, let's say.
But it's funny. Like, again, we're talking about the precarity of Marvel as a business enterprise, and how that could inform when it decides to take stances. I think one of the things that's fascinating about Black Panther, obviously a character I love and know a lot about, is he's introduced in 1966 in the Fantastic Four, and I think, again, we have to take with a grain of salt how much intentionality that Stanley and Jack Kirby might have infused into the creation of this character. But I think it's a very kind of savvy move for them to this character's African. He's not African American. He's not Black. This is not a character operating in the United States, right? So they can lead all of the kind of civil rights movement conversations and potential explosiveness by having this character come from a secret hidden country in the African continent. And that way, we don't have to talk about any of this stuff. The name, as far as we are given to understand, is a total coincidence, not meant to gesture at Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party. And in fact, for those watching who may not know, Marvel changed the character's name for a brief period of time to the Black Leopard in order to further distance T'Challa and Wakanda away from the Black Panther Party, and went so far as to say it explicitly in the text. T'Challa says, I forget the exact wording. Douglas, you can back me up here. You probably know it, but he says, yeah, all that business in the United States, I just want to kind of create some a buffer between them and us. But I think to hear Jack Kirby tell it, he's the company needed a Black character, and I decided to create one. And I think when you look at, the Black Panther's publishing history, it's fascinating because there have been times when he's been used to take very explicit, to be used as a vessel for commentary on systemic racial oppression. So you have a Roy Thomas story somewhere in the 70s in the Fantastic Four, where he's in jail in the company in a fictional country called Rhodesia, which is meant to stand in for South Africa. So it's very much a commentary on apartheid.
Rhodesia is a real country. Is it Did you mean
no? It's named after who's the
Xenia?
Kipling?
Rudyard.
No,
Rudyard.
Rudyard, yes, because it's after Rudyard Kipling. Yes,
Rhodesia was a real country. Yeah.
Yes,
It's a real country. Yeah.
But like, so he's in jail in an analog to South Africa, and the Thing and the Human Torch have to go in and bust him out. And then at the height of the kind of like global response to the South African apartheid government in 1988, there's a miniseries written by Peter B. Gillis, drawn by Dennis Cohen, where T'Challa as a world leader is confronted by like the Panther God, and is like, who's like, what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about this apartheid situation? Again, it's not exactly South Africa. It's a fictional country that has their own superheroes, but like the Panther God, T'Challa's taking this kind of like middle of the road diplomatic political stance. And he's like, well, if you're not going to do something about this, I'm going to strip the powers of Black Panther from you. And, gives him to like another, unnamed Black character who becomes like this more violent avatar of the Panther God. So like it's interesting to see like when and how these stances happen, right? These story decisions are making. And like Danny alluded to, the company eventually gets so big where like, some of these things kind of pass through without much oversight. But like, I think it's still, really telling and honestly kind of brave in some of these moments where like this stuff, a decision gets made to craft this story, and it gets through. It goes all the way through to a comic shop where somebody can pick it up somewhere.
And kind of tying together what you're saying, Evan, and the thing that Danny was saying earlier about how a lot of these 60s characters came out of like very specifically Cold War anxieties and Cold War tensions. And a lot of the power of these stories and these characters is that they are coming out of things that people are concerned about, that the people making the stories and the people reading the stories like care about a lot. If you're going to do a kind of genre of story that is about struggle and about combat, then it makes sense to have them be in some way about the actual struggles that people are really, really interested in. And that's what this story especially. Sorry.
Did I step on?
No.
Another thing that I think that these stories come out of is the origins of comics. I mean, if you look back at the very beginnings of superhero comics, you have Superman, the original social justice warrior, as done by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and you have the World War II, the Depression era, and World War II, anti-Nazi, anti-racist message of the comics. And then you have Marvel's first hero was not Captain America, and it was not Spider-Man. Marvel's first, its first flight of heroes was Submariner, a biracial, angry guy who was the enemy of the human. I mean, he was declared enemy of the human race till World War II happened, and then he decided that the Allies were better than the Nazis. But I think even up until the most recent Marvel movies, TV shows, World War II and the Red Skull and the Nazis, that so fuels this whether people know it or like it or not, it fuels this social justice tradition of some kind, I think.
I mean, you look at those early Namor stories, to your point, Danny, Bill Everett was the creator, writer, artist of those early Submariner stories. And the text explicitly says, oh yeah, I'm going to wage war against white men, which is hilarious to me because Namor is drawn as a white man, but like he's clearly coded as like an other, right? A sociopolitical other, right? So like, again, the idea that this is justice coming from the bottom, right? Like literally from underneath the sea, right? Is something that I think is core to the DNA of the comics. And what's really interesting is, 40 some odd years later, Namor gets reinterpreted as a mutant, right? Like, and mutants as a vast metaphor within the Marvel universe, almost from the beginning, have meant to represent the outsider, right? We're not going to we can, it's been an apocryphal kind of interpretation that the Marvel's X-Men comics were meant to invoke the civil rights movement, and Professor X stands in for Martin Luther King and Magneto for Malcolm X. I don't take much truck with that. I think, that wasn't intentional from the beginning, and that you really only start to see that when Chris Claremont starts handling those characters in the 1970s. I'm going to hand off to you in a second, Stephanie.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think, one of the things that folds really neatly into superheroes as an ideological concept is that they are aspirational metaphors a lot of times, right? And they're sometimes the things we wish we could do, we want to do in pursuit of larger kind of goals of justice, and being able to coexist with each other. But Stephanie, tell us about the X-Men metaphors.
Oh, I don't know much more about them than you do. I do want to credit in terms of thinking about how the X-Men in particular and Marvel Mutants interact with social movements and identities. I want to credit the podcaster and critic and editor Jay Edidin, and I want to credit the critic and scholar Ramsey Fawaz, who wrote a very good book called The New Mutants. That's the name of the book. Comic book superheroes and the American radical imagination. So if you want to read more about that, Ramsey does not like North Star's Wedding. He thinks it's homonormative. I disagree. I loved it. But we agree on a lot. So I really dislike the idea that Professor X is Martin Luther King and Magneto is Malcolm X.
It just doesn't match.
It does not match. The timeline doesn't work, and the ideologies don't work. And the idea that Marvel Mutants are good ways of talking about racial identity and racial injustice in the United States, it just doesn't work very well. And when X-Men writers want to talk about race, they create characters and aren't stupid about it. They talk about it using, the writers I like. When the X-Men writers I like want to talk about race, they create intersectional identities and have Black characters who are mutants and Asian characters who are mutants, as Marjorie Liu, who's one of my favorite X runs, did. Because significant physical difference, not just I'm a different color, my hair is different, but I can fly and you can't. You can walk down the street and not get stared at.
Destructive eye beams come out of my face,
right. And also, like, I need to wear glasses all the time or I can't go anywhere. My body is different and feels different. That's a shitty metaphor for race. I'm sorry, I just used a word that you can bleep that out if we're on the radio. It's a bad metaphor for race. It's not a bad, and Jay never stops making this point, it's a much better metaphor for disability. And if you want to go there, it is a better metaphor for certain kinds of queer and trans identities, especially the ones that involve bodily difference and not just difference in feeling. And that doesn't show up in Silver Age X-Men as far as I know at all. Silver Age X-Men thinks about race and they think about hippies a lot. And the earliest X-Men stories, if they're thinking about social movements at all, they're thinking about hippies and beatniks and youth in revolt. X-Comics get much more interesting in terms of their politics for me, although those, Roy Thomas, Neil Adams stories are fun. X-Comics get politically interesting not long after Chris Claremont starts being the head writer and Louise Jones is editing, and there's a rotating cast of artists that eventually includes people like Paul Smith and Bill Sienkiewicz, who are on board with what Claremont is trying to do ideologically, which the most famous 80s X penciler, John Byrne, is not. He's just good at drawing people. They start to look like they're thinking about disability. They start to look like they're thinking about queerness and gender and sexuality. And they start to look like they're thinking about Israel. Because when Claremont, who is the lead X-writer from the late 70s to 1991, a lot of some of the best stories are written by other people who are, notably not white dudes, Louise Simonson and Nesenti. But when Claremont talks about what he's trying to do in its real world analogs, one of the things he actually says is the conflict between Magneto, 80s Magneto, not movie Magneto, not 60s Magneto, the conflict between 80s Magneto and Professor X over what to do about mutants being hated and feared is modeled on the conflict early in the history of the Israeli state between David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. And this is happening during the period when Menachem Begin, who I think is the first Likud prime minister of Israel, the first one who's viewed as right-wing by the leaders of other developed nations. It's happening during the period when Begin is taking over and consolidating power in Israel and doing things like invading Lebanon. And that is intentional. And that interest in using mutants to represent politics around Israel-Palestine absolutely continues into the X comics, not Marvel Comics in general, but the comics that come out of the X office that are being published literally this week. And we can talk about that right now. But the Israel-Palestine thing works for Marvel Mutants in a way that American conflict around civil rights and race and anti-blackness and white supremacy, Marvel Mutants are not a good way to talk about that, unless they're Black mutants, in which case they are.
But Stephanie, I think you can trace that back to the World War II and Holocaust with Magneto, with Claremont establishing Magneto as, as a Holocaust survivor. It took Marvel years to say whether or not he was actually Jewish or Roma or was in the camp for whatever reason. But that I think that ties back to World War II being the energy source that powers the entire Marvel mythology, really.
That's absolutely right. And it creates problems for modern Marvel writers, which I believe they've handled by just saying that Magneto is exceptionally long-lived. There is a panel in X-Men Black Magneto from 2019, which is a Claremont story that addresses that. But Magneto, as the last people who saw the Second World War take place, start to not be alive anymore. We are seeing an intradiegetic problem, a plotting problem, what to do about characters who will forever be tied to the Second World War, as the whole Marvel universe is. And it's fun to see how they handle that.
I think it's safe to say that Stanley never used the word interdiegetic, but but it's a great word.
He knew what it meant.
That's true.
If you want, I can say within the story, real to the characters, but that's longer.
Be your academic self, Professor Burt. Please.
Oh no, it was not a criticism. No.
Okay.
But he might have thought interdiegetic referred to not having too much sugar or something. Anyway, I have a feeling. Well, they haven't told us we have to get to questions yet, but I did. Since I have a feeling that probably half or more of the people watching this may be more familiar with the movies and TV shows. Can we? Anybody have any
pivot
thoughts
a little
on,
bit? Yeah, it's funny.
How
on
this
that subject
impacts on the shows.
Yeah, obviously Black Panther became a global phenomenon when the movie came out in 2018, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that's really interesting is that like the ideation of the Black Panther mythos that you see on screen is really such a late-breaking kind of addition to the character's publishing history. Like that stuff, really doesn't start until 1998, and the character was already around for like 30 some odd years. And I think the movie is only possible by virtue of, a lot of unsung Black creators who moved through Marvel and touched on this character. It's my own personal theory. I'm biased, obviously, because I'm part of the cohort. But like, I think every time a Black person touches Black Panther and Wakanda, like the idea of it all complicates, So like going back to like 1977, when an artist named Billy Graham starts drawing Don McGregor stories, like the visual language that he develops for Wakanda is just beautiful. And like, it comes from like the Black is beautiful kind of zeitgeist of that moment. You know, he's drawing big afros and dashikis, and he's eschewing a lot of the, you know, a grass hut and spear throwing stereotypes that it had continued to play character, you know. And he's like, there's like this cosmopolitanism that is like really astounding to see in those pages. And then, you know, later on, Dennis Cohen draws that story in 1988. And, you know, Cohen is a guy whose politics are fairly left-leaning and very pro-Black. And you see that energy come out in the page. And then in 1998, Christopher Priest, who was, you know, the first full-time editor and writer at Marvel, he starts writing a Black Panther comic, which completely like reinvents the socio-political context that the character operates in. You know, it's like, okay, if this is a character that's been hidden, isolationist, rather it's a country that's been hidden, isolationist, like how does that inform this man's psychology as a superhero and this country's, you know, affect on the world stage? And all that stuff goes straight into the Black Panther movie. So, you know, and I think, you know, you compare like the Captain America movies, for example, like they pretty much do exactly what those early Captain America stories did, right? But the Black Panther movie goes very much a different way from his original ideation, because it has to speak to a global Black diasporan audience as a notion of clear intent from Ryan Coogler and everybody who helped make that movie. So the movies are really interesting in how, like, you take the aggregate publishing histories of these individual characters or teams like the Avengers and like, okay, how do you reinterpret them for a modern audience who hasn't been steeped in this stuff for decades, like all of us?
Yeah. As I'm I want to say something that's going to move us a little bit away from Wakanda to a larger set of questions about what Marvel properties can do, and then we can come back to Wakanda, which is one of the claims that 60s Marvel makes to distinguish itself from, you know, the other company that owns Superman and from larger kinds of science fictional stories, is that Marvel stories take place in the real world. I remember somewhere there's an interview. I think it's after 9/11 happens, where they talk to whoever is in the revolving door Marvel editor-in-chief position at the time, and they say, you know, what can Marvel Comics do that other comics can't do, and other, you know, fantasy media for all ages can't do? And the answer that whoever is on the other end of the line gives is Marvel Comics take place in the real world. Rudy Giuliani is the mayor of New York in Marvel Comics. And of course, there's a line, Douglas, I think you've done a series of Instagram posts about this, of various presidents of the United States, up to but not including the orange guy, showing up and being clearly recognizable on page from Marvel. Jimmy Carter, of course, shows up in the Dark Phoenix saga. And that's cool. It's also literally not true, right? Galactus doesn't show up in the real world and try to eat the Earth. Wakanda isn't a real country. But there are limits on how much the Marvel 616 main continuity, and I guess how much the MCU can diverge from our world. Something's buzzing. Is it me?
Yeah, I don't know. It's some weird feed.
Seems to be a truck somewhere, or
Possibly. Let me try muting.
Yep, that's you, Douglas.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. There are limits to how much a Marvel story can have consequences for the entire world. You can do anything you want to the characters, and you can do anything you want to the government of a fictional country like Wakanda or Krakoa or Genosha. But you can't replace the form of government in the United States or the UK, or, you know,
not in the present anyway. In the future is fair game.
In the future, you can do whatever you want, and those restrictions on what kind of story you can tell and still be part of Marvel continuity creates two things in general, and you see different Marvel teams and different Marvel characters react in different ways. One thing is that it creates, if you're telling the story, limits on what you can do, right? You can't start a successful revolution in the United States or even in California. The other thing it does is it means that readers and therefore critics and therefore scholars like me get to yell about whether that makes Marvel Comics inherently assimilationist or liberal or incrementalist, and if so, whether that's bad. And my distinguished colleagues elsewhere in academia often argue that between the exaltation of individuals who are not law enforcement officers doing violent things and the fact that you can't actually completely change the system of government in a real country, that makes all superhero comics right-wing or something. And I couldn't disagree more. And I've got two grounds for disagreement, which I'll try to spell out briefly and then I'll shut up. One is that all the time in real life, especially if we are close to or members of marginalized groups, we see acts of injustice and acts of violence that are not being countered by representatives of the state, and we have to decide what to do. My favorite example of that is not in a Marvel comic. It's in a comic called Strong Female Protagonist, where our strong female protagonist, who's super strong, has to wrestle with whether there should be superheroes, whether she thinks that anyone should be a superhero, given her left politics. And she ends up helping starting a line for people who are fleeing domestic abuse, where superheroes will protect them when restraining orders cannot. So individuals have to make decisions about force all the time in real life, unfortunately. Then the other line of argument is that it doesn't work to show up and say, my 3 friends and I have guns and we are going to change your system of government. Stories about attempted revolutions in real countries and in fictional countries often. And it doesn't just confine itself to superhero comics. It's in George Eliot's novel, Felix Holt the Radical. You're not going to get what you want in terms of broad social change unless you've got some kind of popular support. Unless what you want to do is impose an unpopular revolution by force, and that's, we don't like that. So I have no problem with superhero stories, and Marvel structurally has to do this. Superhero stories saying if you want to completely change the way a country is governed, people with I-beams and flight, we can do a lot of things for you, but we can't do that. You have to do that.
Now, I want to kind of piggyback on that, and I apologize for the lawnmower noise outside, but to address Danny's point about movies and TV being the way that these stories reach people now, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier addresses pretty much directly the idea of, are superpowered beings inherently fascist? Is this a thing that it is morally permissible to do? And for a lot of where it's coming from, it draws, once again, on a bunch of old comics. It draws on Mark Grunwald's run on Captain America in the 80s, where there is one character after another who is put in the position of being the symbol of an ideology. And there's the Flag Smasher, and there's U.S. Agent, who's the sort of right-wing Captain America who gets to be Captain America for a while. Like, all this stuff, it's right there in the comics. It's right there as source material for this new kind of visual media to boil down and use. But that's where a lot of it comes from.
Yeah, it's funny to kind of bring in all the stuff that some of the threads are talking about. Like, Danny, you talked about how when you wrote Superman on the Couch, one of the takeaways is superhero characters are power fantasies. And, what's interesting, I think, to think about the way these characters kind of evolve and change now that, like, superhero culture is kind of ascendant, right? It's very much triumphant in pop culture. But what Stephanie was saying is, like, what they continue to allow us to do is to think about what justice looks like, right? Like, for people who don't have access to the systems that kind of inform the prevailing power structure, right? Like, and there's a lot of tension to be had when you think about, okay, well, the core of creators that are making these stories, where do they come from? Like, how can they express their politics? If they want to, will they be allowed to? And as these become bigger corporate endeavors, like those moments where it can happen, I feel like are increasingly unique and can be increasingly powerful. Like one of the great things about, for example, the most recent Black Panther comics that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote, his last kind of big epic storyline was the intergalactic empire of Wakanda, where a bunch of Wakandans get lost in space and time and wind up forming an empire, which is like, kind of imperialist and expansionist and counter to the ethos of Wakanda as are traditionally understood. And it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that? Like what next? And, this is going to sound like a plug for a book, but like I wrote a story that kind of follows up on some of that stuff. And, T'Challa has to reckon with this idea, like, I didn't create this. It is a legacy of our history. And now I've inherited this apparatus of empire. What do I do with it? And I think that's a really provocative question for something that's made within, like, an American mega corporation of subdivision, because it's the kind of reckonings with history within our own mainstream political culture, like that people don't want to have.
Yeah. Evan, where can we find your story? You said that you wrote a story set in that Space Empire universe.
It's a comic that's coming out in September. That's called Last Annihilation, Wakanda. Sorry, Douglas, I'm breaking news here. That's going to be coming out later this year. So, I think, but back to the topic at hand, like there are still possibilities. And to what you were saying before, Stephanie, like, yeah, Marvel comics don't actually happen in the real world, right? And as a kind of risk averse, more top down corporate mentality potentially restricts the storytelling possibilities in this area, I think that it behooves creators to like just think more expansively and metaphorically. Like the stuff that's happening in the X-Men comics now is straight up political commentary, but they just have to do it through like several metaphorical fictional layers so that you can't necessarily interpret it as a commentary on any kind of like geopolitical situation in the real world.
Well, I mean, except that sometimes you can, right? They don't overthrow existing governments, but they have they are literally providing life-saving drugs in order to undermine big pharma, which extorts people for their life-saving drugs. Like that's not
right.
That you don't have to do a lot of interpretive work there. The other thing that your sort of introduction is making me think about is the relationships among the people making the comics, the things we see in the comics, and the fans who are reading them. And this is very different between the current comics and the much, much larger fan base for MCU film and TV. If you spend a lot of time in X-Men fandom, which is good for me, and maybe I don't recommend it for everyone, what you see is a whole lot of queer and trans and autistic people and people who identify as disabled, who have various kinds of disabilities, yelling and yelling and yelling about why can't Marvel do more to represent us? And you see almost the way that you see in real life social movements, a lot of frustrating incremental real life. All X-Men fans are real people and we exist in real life in social movements that affect what governments do with the laws and the budgets of actual governments rather than what a comic book company does. You see frustrating incremental progress. There was the first on-page binary trans mutant, the first on-page mutant who says I was assigned one sex at birth and I'm the other one, is a character called Jessie Drake, who appears in 2 issues of Marvel Comics Presents, written by Ann DeSanti and drawn, I think, by Steve Lytle in about 1992. It's a great story. It's a very violent story because that was a violent line. It was connected to Wolverine comics and Daredevil comics. But Jessie Drake shows up and is trans on page and is pretty good representation, very good representation for the era, and then isn't shown again until this year.
Until next week.
Until next week. Yeah. And you have a small number of very active fans and semi-professional, I guess is the term, writers and critics yelling on the internet about where is Jessie Drake, Jessie Drake Appreciation Society, bring back Jessie Drake. Here is a non-commercial fan work of a transformative work about Jessie Drake. Where is Jessie Drake? With the expectation that nothing will ever happen. And then Zoe Tunnell, by the way, if you want to track down her writing, is the person to look for there. But a couple of us. And I wasn't really part of this. I was just, you go ahead with your maximalist demands. Let's see what the writers can get through the upper levels of Disney. And it happened. It happened. Jessie Drake is showing up on page again in what is a story that I have high hopes for next week. So
the readers are the real editors. That's right. Because you, the readers, are the real editors. As Stan used to say.
I mean, wait, Stan Lee said that?
Always, constantly.
Okay.
Did he enact that? Did he implement that? Is a real question.
He did. That was an issue Steve Ditko had with him. And Ditko used to feel like, well, what is Stan listening to these readers? Ditko felt that Stan was like weak-willed and would do whatever the readers wanted because he was so eager to please. And Ditko felt that was not the way to make comics. Joanna tells me we actually have some questions from people watching. So let's hear them.
Right. We have a question from Sky. He says, the latest Falcon and the Winter Soldier series presents an interesting perspective of freedom fighters who had the goal of achieving justice for displaced people. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great premise. I don't know if the show really followed through on what it could mean in that context. They were largely a foil for the main character's own psychological churn about what it would mean to be a symbol of a country, which has always treated him well. I wish there were more developed. But, like going back to something that Danny said, the thing about most superhero characters is that they almost always uphold the status quo, so whether that makes them inherently politically right or left leaning, I think, is up for interpretation. But most superhero stories, because you kind of want to leave the fictional construct in the same places where you found it, like they tend to reset back to status quo. So I think, it would be interesting to see superhero stories where a cohort like that are the protagonists, and you do see that in kind of things that are further afield and not, like Stephanie said, Marvel real world, where the premise has to be like, okay, well, you're supposed to reflect the real world, and in the real world, what does a movement like this look like? So yeah, it was, I think, an interesting idea that I wish they'd done it a little bit more with.
I want to add to that a little bit. You don't see in Marvel stories superheroes starting successful revolutions in real countries, because you can't. You see successful revolutions in fictional countries, which can be good or bad. And you see superheroes, I actually disagree with the idea that modern superheroes uphold the status quo. Historically, that's 100% true. But my favorite superhero stories are often about powered people who say, the status quo kind of sucks. Let us see what we can do to change it incrementally, since we can't just knock everything down and have a blank slate. That is, me being very, center-left incrementalist. But you can absolutely have superheroes, and I think we have a lot of them now, who are very dissatisfied with the way things are.
Isn't it more often supervillains who will do that? I mean, that's the premise of things like Emperor Doom and
right.
comes to mind.
Right. I mean,
but it's also the premise of Squadron Supreme going back to the 80s.
Thank you, Bart Grunwald. Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Squadron Supreme is about let's see what happens when superheroes decide to overthrow the United States government. It doesn't work out that well. But this doesn't mean that Ms. Marvel is extremely happy with every aspect of life in contemporary America. She's clearly not. she's just not gonna, blow up the mayor's office in Jersey City, because that won't work.
Joanna, we have more questions?
I guess not.
I have a question for, we have a question via email for Douglas Wolk, saying, I'm really excited about your new book. Is it going to be translated in German?
I would love it to be. If you feel, if you're in a position to make that happen, please contact, please, let me know.
Okay. Any other questions there?
We did get one more question. Was Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent parody of Jordan Peterson and his Captain America a collaborative choice? And what are your comments on that?
I have no insight on that. And I have no comment on it, I think. What I will say is, and again, Ta-Nehisi and I are friends, but I we didn't talk about that particular story choice. But I think, characters like the Red Skull, mega maniacal, would-be world-conquering villains often get written as people who want to control the hearts and minds, hold psychological sway over people. And I think that's a behavior that you can't pin just to, I think, one real world person. I think, there are lots of people from, petty dictators to, elected officials in this country of ours who use the same tactics that were kind of being invoked in that sequence. So, that is a place where the real world shows up in the fiction, like where, people who want to gain political power and do so through persuasive psychological means, they do exist. And I think that's fair game to use in a comic book.
Cool. Well, I think that seems like a pretty good place to wrap up. So I'll say, anybody has anything they meant to say or wanted to say, they didn't get a chance to. And of course, since the spirit of Stanley is animating this, anything you want to plug or sell that you have coming up. So we'll start with Evan.
Well, yeah, I have a coming Black Panther one shot that I mentioned, which has not even been officially announced. So who knows if I'll get in trouble, but that'll be out in September. I've got Rise of the Black Panther, which is collected in trade paperback. You should be able to get it digitally or in brick and mortar stores. And I've got a WWE comic based on the professional wrestling tag team, The New Day, which will be out in July cool. and August. It was super fun to write.
Cool. You could do a whole panel, you could do a whole book about the relation between wrestling and superheroes.
Very much so.
Thank you. Douglas, what's happening with you?
I'm just going to once again plug all the Marvels coming out in October from Penguin Books in the US, and it will also be out in the UK and apparently Russia. And voiceoflatveria.com for my podcast.
Cool. And Stephanie?
I'm so excited about what all of you are doing. Evan texted me about the wrestling comics people, because half the comics critics I work with also write about wrestling.
Really? Okay.
And are going to really want to talk to you. I have a chapbook, which means a short book of poems with a staple that binds it. That's like 30 pages instead of 80, of poems that are mostly about the X-Men. That's going to be out this summer from Rain Taxi Editions. There's going to be a new book of poems with a proper binding that's 80 pages long. That's partly about the X-Men, coming out from Grey Wolf Press in probably fall of 2022. And I have a book called Don't Read Poetry, a book about how to read poems, which pretty much is what it says on the tin, which came out in 2019 and is 2019, still available at leading places to buy books.
Thank you. And I've got, yes, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stanley, in paperback, in hardcover and in paperback, and in audiobook. So just imagine 14 hours of this. And because it wasn't controversial enough to write about Stanley, I'm working on books about Bob Dylan and Jack Ruby. So not Jack Kirby, Jack Ruby. So those will hopefully be arriving somewhere in the not too distant future. And you can find me on Danny at DannyFingeroth.com and often on Facebook and social media or emails for you guys.
My social media, Evan Narc on Twitter, EVNARC.
Yeah. Douglas Wolk, Twitter.
And Stephanie?
Accommodatingly, ACCOMMODATINGLY. On Twitter, it's a long story, but if you just look for my name, you will get me and a very talented food writer from South Carolina. So the Stephanie Burt who does superheroes and poems and not the Southern food writer.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thank you, Joanna. I think we have come to the conclusion. So thank you, Joanna and AmeriKahaus.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, AmeriKahaus, Joanna, Douglas, Evan, Danny, audience, all the people, all the
all
the Marvels.
Thank you so much for being here. And also for those of you who are in Munich, definitely check out our current exhibition at AmeriKahaus, 60 Years of Marvel Comics Universe. We have over 180 original drawings on our walls. It's a fantastic exhibition. And to those of you who are watching us in our theater right now, thanks for joining us. And we wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, Danny.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Everybody stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'm hitting the leave button now.
Okay.
Don't
Bye,
try
everybody.
to stop me. Bye.